What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some lore, or like a lore primer, overview, that kind of thing for the Divinity series, the franchise as a whole. Because, of course, the new Divinity game was just recently announced at the Game Awards 2025, and while the trailer was incredibly intriguing, it also obviously brought a lot of questions with it, as the Divinity series is actually pretty long-standing, and yet most of its games are relatively obscure outside of Original Sin 1 and 2. But as it just so happens, while I do mostly review games these days, there was a time where this channel was a Divinity lore channel. I've played all of these games, I know a great deal about them, and I thought I would put some of that to work for you guys, update some of my old lore videos. And while we don't know too much about what the upcoming game is going to actually cover, and we'll actually talk about some of that and some of my own lore speculation towards the end of this video, what I can do is kind of give people an overview of the series, what games you should play, what order in which they should be played, what's relevant, what's not, just to give people something a little more up to date than my old lore videos, which are like 5 years old. Because while most of that information is entirely up to date, the quality of the videos is certainly older, frankly. So my current plan is to put this video out, which is a big overview about all of the important stuff and the most common questions I've seen in my own speculation, to give people a good solid foundation and push them in the right direction for more. Following on from that, one of my lore videos that I absolutely need to remake is unfortunately probably the one people are watching the most, which is my old series timeline video. That was, I think, one of my very first lore videos for the series, and while none of it is inaccurate really, there's a lot I could change there quality-wise and update some things, clarify now that I've learned to make videos a little better, to be honest. So this video and that timeline video, which you'll hopefully see here in a few days, are definitely the top of the priority list. There's a couple other things that I want to mention, but I think these two videos combined should get people mostly up to date. That said, we're about to talk about a lot here, and so there will be timestamps down below where you can kind of click around the video and get to the parts you actually want to hear about, because we're going to cover some generalities about canon, the order in which the games present themselves, the genres, broad lore for the universe, including like races and stuff. Then we're going to go game by game and talk about what's important, and then we're going to end the video with some of my own personal lore speculation about the trailer and what's going on there. Speaking of the trailer, I cannot show much of any of that to you. It is incredibly gory and graphic, and YouTube will age restrict that in a heartbeat. But luckily, I do have footage from all of the other games thanks to all of my old lore videos and coverage for them. Speaking of, though, it's probably worth a mention as well up towards the beginning here that there was actually a cancelled game in the series as well, Divinity Fallen Heroes. That game, being cancelled, probably shouldn't be taken too seriously, as they very well may have workshopped some of the ideas from that into the new thing, but it's impossible to really say with any certainty what that stuff is. Now, as mentioned, I want to kick this video off with a little discussion about canon. So one thing that I would tell you all the way to today, but even back then when I was making those lore videos, is that the actual lore for the Divinity series is a bit of a mess. The reason for that is that Larian did not start taking the world of this seriously and like trying to put real continuity into it until Original Sin 1 and 2. Because of that, so much of like the old games will contradict new games. There's like direct conflicts, plot holes, all of those things. Truth be told, this new game will very likely retcon and change some things, even introduce new lore that might recontextualize some of this old stuff. So what I'm going to give you is like the current rundown and probably best way to think about what is and isn't canon at the moment. But keep in mind, there is and always has been some flexibility with this stuff. Larian has never shied away from changing something to make it work for the story they want to tell. The easiest example of that is directly from the trailer. The big statue that was revealed as part of it was referred to as the Hellstone. That's like the official name for it. The thing is, there's not actually a place called Hell in Rivellon. There are analogs to it, yes, like Tartarus and Nemesis, Tartarus being like the most, this is probably what people in this universe would consider hell type of place. But I mean, realistically, they probably just changed it to hell because that's simpler for the people watching the trailer and trying to engage with the subject matter. And, you know, maybe the people of Rivellon have just shorthanded it to hell somehow. Now, the lore, like plot holes and retcons, that kind of thing, range from super small stuff like that to giant gaping plot holes. Multiple sources in the early games specifically say that Lucian the Divine only had one son, and then in Original Sin 2, he's got a full-grown second child named Alexander. One of the origin characters from Original Sin 2, the Red Prince, spouse of the Sun, His origin story, while really cool and is about red dragons, just to give you the obvious lead there, however, almost everything that is mentioned about the sort of back and forth between the lizards and the dragons as part of his story contradicts like everything we know about them previously. And yeah, there's plenty of ways they could write around that, but my point is there is a lot of wiggle room in terms of canon here. But as mentioned, Original Sin 1 is where they really started to actually care about this stuff and try to make it more cohesive. And so Original Sin 1 and Original Sin 2 are the latest games in the series. With them also being the games that take the lore the most seriously, it's probably safe to assume that that stuff is canon, especially since the press release for this new game specifically mentions that people who have played those games will have a better understanding of the upcoming game, even though they aren't necessarily required playing or anything like that. Which, to my mind, confirms this is probably the right way to think about it, with Original Sin 1 and Original Sin 2 being the sort of bookmarks of what we should and should not be considering canon. Even then, though, that presents a couple of problems. But let's stick to the most relevant stuff for now. So, luckily, in Original Sin 1 and 2, we get a bunch of information and references to most of the other games that actually confirms a lot of what is important in those games. The catch being that that applies to all but one game. There is one Divinity game that actually takes place after Original Sin 2, about 60 years after it to be specific. And confusingly enough, it is also called Divinity 2 Ego Draconis. Together with its expansion, the Flames of Vengeance, those two, the game and its expansion, are known as the Dragon Knight Saga. So because we don't know when this new game is set or when it takes place, and the fact that they haven't touched anything past Original Sin 2 in terms of like the new lore and world they've built out, while we're going to talk about Divinity 2 and some of its importance in the lore, it's probably important to understand then that Divinity 2, in terms of everything else they've covered, is the most up for debate. They could realistically trim off everything about that game and take it in an entirely new direction if they chose to do that. And if they were going to change up and, move the lore around, that's probably what they would do because it would be the simplest thing to do. But ultimately, that is something that only Larian knows, at least for the time being, and I think it's important that people understand that as a baseline. Next up, before we start talking more important stuff about the games themselves, there's probably going to be some spoilers in this video, at least during the sections that cover those individual games. I will be fully spoiling most of those games, in fact, so you may want to avoid the game sections if that's something you're concerned about. So with that spoiler warning out of the way, the next thing I want to do is talk about the recommended games you should play and then the chronological order. Now, in terms of recommended games, if you weren't listening to what I just said, I suppose, and jumped to this part of the video, the games that are mentioned and the most relevant in relation to this upcoming new game are Original Sin 1 and Original Sin 2, which shouldn't be any surprise. They are the newest games in the series, and they are the ones where, again, they started taking the lore seriously, and what happened there is supposed to inform this new game somehow. If you want to play as few of these games as possible to get caught up, Original Sin 1, Original Sin 2, it's not even a question. You should get enough info from both of those games to get an idea of what the world and stuff is about. However, even that comes with some oddities that we'll get into here in a moment, in particular because Original Sin 1 is, I would say, a little more like allegorical in its storytelling. Its story is not all that different from like Greek myths or like Pandora's box even. There's a lot of like hidden meaning in it as opposed to being a direct story in a lot of senses, and in some way it's almost like somebody looking back at past events and recounting them to you in a strange way, whereas Original Sin 2 tends to be a little more grounded and literal. Something to keep in mind if you choose to play those. However, let's assume you want to play all of them because you're feeling brave and don't mind playing a few ancient games that barely run on modern hardware. You may want to know what the chronological order of these games is. So, first you have to understand the timeline. Divinity as a series has a timeline not all that different from our own in the sense that it has effectively like a BC and an AD. In this case, though, AR and AD. AR being the equivalent to BC and AD just being AD. Now, very luckily, I would say, one of the games we can pretty much disregard entirely in terms of the lore, and that is actually Divinity Dragon Commander, which was an odd, like, experimental RTS game meets, like, dating sim. It's very tongue-in-cheek, it's got a lot of jokes. But why do I say that it is irrelevant to the rest of the series? Well, that's because it is way outside of the timeline of everything else. Dragon Commander takes place about 8,800 years before the next game in the timeline. So this game takes place in 8800 AR or BC. They did that because of the experimental nature of it, allowing them to effectively kind of do whatever they wanted and then throw it away when they were done. Dragon Commander is an interesting game in its own, and it certainly takes elements from the rest of the series, but it is irrelevant to basically everything else going on, and is likely going to be unremarkable in terms of the upcoming story. Neat game, worth checking out if you just want to check out something weird, but lore-wise, it's next to meaningless. Probably the only thing worth mentioning is that there's a demon in that game named Corvus who is unique, who I suppose could come back, but it wouldn't have much to do with Dragon Commander. And then the other guy is Maxos. Maxos is an extremely old and considered the most powerful wizard around type of guy. Dragon Commander is the only game he is actually in. He is referenced in other games, but that's the only one you actually physically talk to the guy in. Next up from Dragon Commander, you then have Original Sin 1. Original Sin 1 takes place in 4 AD, so about 8,800 years in the future, past Dragon Commander. As I've already mentioned, Original Sin 1 was a bit more of an allegorical approach to storytelling, and it also introduced a bunch of stuff that they've just never done anything with since. We'll touch more on this here in a moment. It's a little too much for this section where I'm just talking chronological stuff, but there's more to know there for sure. Now, the very first game in the series is actually the next game in our timeline because we jump forward another roughly 1,200 years to 1218 AD. This is Divine Divinity, the very first game that Larian made in the Divinity series. Divine Divinity, as the first game, is both rough in terms of lore and everything, but it's also actually extremely relevant to the story. Lucian the Divine, who's a main character we'll talk about, is who you play canonically in Divine Divinity. You have a choice of several different characters, but canonically you played a male warrior who then became the Divine as part of Divine Divinity. The Divine meaning that he was chosen and empowered by the 7 gods to lead their will, basically. Again, more on that in a moment, though. Following on from Divine Divinity, we actually have the sequel to that game, Beyond Divinity. Now, a lot happens in between Divine and Beyond. Beyond Divinity takes place in 1238, deals with Lucian's adopted son Damien after he was banished to a plane called Nemesis, and the game is about him escaping. Curiously, after he escapes, never heard from again for a long, long time, until Divinity 2, about 60 years in fact, which is why, after Beyond Divinity, the next game chronologically is Original Sin 2, the most recent game in terms of releases. Original Sin 2 takes place in 1244 AD. And as far as the stuff that can be taken at face value in terms of the lore and how it's presented, Original Sin 2 is kind of the end of the line, because next up after Original Sin 2, we then have the latest game in the series, timeline-wise, that was released, which is actually Divinity 2, Ego Draconis, and its expansion, Flames of Vengeance. That leaves about a 60-year gap that this new game could theoretically fill, or it could even come after Divinity 2. But realistically, it could also come before, depending on how much they want to mess around with the lore, but given everything we know about it and what they've said so far, my guess would be after Original Sin 2. Personally, we just, again, don't know what they're doing with Ego Draconis in terms of the lore. Especially since really only one of the endings makes the most sense for the events that then happen in Original Sin 2 for what happens in Divinity 2, and I just don't know if they want to hold to that all these years later. Though it did kind of seem like the canceled game Fallen Heroes was going to go that route, so who knows. It's canceled though, so we can't take that at face value. So that is the rough chronological order of the games, and before we start talking about them individually, we're going to set some things up on a grander scale here. We're going to talk about some cosmic events, the races, the gods that go with them, the gods the games don't really tell you about, some of the lore that comes up with the books, but mostly we're going to keep it to the games because that's the stuff that is most relevant, as we have already discussed. Now, as I get into this next part, remember, there's just not actually answers for a lot of the stuff that you may think of as I'm going through this, so feel free to ask your questions down in the comment section below. I will answer them to the best of my ability, but more often than not, the case is going to be that we just don't know. So let's kick it off. Now, the oldest known races, and thus the stuff we can talk about first in terms of the lore and whatnot, is the dragons and the Eternals. The dragons don't come up too much in the series, they are mostly gone. We get most of the information about the dragons from one in particular, an incredibly old guy, known as Patriarch the Black. We talk to him in Divine Divinity, and we talk to him in Divinity 2, where he gives us some information as well. Now, the information you get from the dragons is important in the sense that the dragons are incredibly ancient compared to the other races, as is typically the case with like fantasy stuff, but they are apparently tied to the creation of the actual world in some mysterious way that is never elaborated upon. Patriarch the Black actually tells you that he is only capable of using lesser languages these days because if he were to use the languages he actually knew, he would spawn things into existence like new species of flora, that kind of thing. Dragons, and their only like once mentioned associated god, Ouroboros, don't see a lot of screen time, so you can mostly disregard them, but just interesting tidbits. Realistically, when we're talking about the broader lore of the game itself, you probably want to focus on the Eternals, because these guys were a problem. So, as is established in Original Sin 2, the Eternals kind of indirectly kicked off the events of everything else that happens, and this is because one of their number, Fane, the origin character from Original Sin 2 in particular, discovered what they called the Veil. The Veil is a giant, barrier of soul energy. It's made out of source, which is, again, like soul energy, life energy. It's always been a little vague how they've described it, but basically people gather it as they live, and for a long time, the gods would eat it when they die, feeding them. But the question then is, who are those gods and where do they come from? Well, they were the Eternals. One of the proposed original sins of the Original Sin 1 and 2 games is the fact that Fane, the scholar, and his eternal buddies discovered the Veil and then immediately turned on each other. In particular, the seven gods as they are known, which is a bit of a misnomer. There are more, and we're about to get into that. But the seven, after learning about the source and the Veil and the great power that it held, seized its power for their own, and they cast out the God King, the leader of the Eternals, and all of the other Eternals out into the void, the thing beyond the Veil. We later learned that that was not the end of them through the events of Original Sin 2 as well. We'll circle back around to that soon enough. But having done this, seized all of this godlike power for themselves, kicked out their enemies, the seven got to work and they started creating the other races in their images. This is where we get the standard races of the game. Now, there is, typically speaking, in the Divinity universe, one god associated with one race, though it gets a little weird fast. So you've got humans, dwarves, elves, lizards, imps, and orcs. Those are the biggest ones that each have an associated god, but then it starts getting a tiny bit strange. So we actually have that seventh god, because if you counted, I only mentioned 6 races there. The seventh god, Amadia, is the goddess of wizards. Wizards in Divinity are strange. We only meet a couple of them, Maxos, Zandalore, and Arhu, but they are usually considered like a race unto themselves in some way, and they tend to be way more powerful than your average analog of whatever their race actually is. I've actually made videos on each of them individually if you're curious. But for now, we're going to keep it moving. All of that said, though, a couple other oddities to mention. You can play the undead in Original Sin 2. The undead do not have an associated deity, really. They're just kind of a fact of life. There's even a nation of them in Dragon Commander. Now, in Original Sin 2, a lot of the undead are associated with the Sworn, which are people who were raised into undeath by the God King. But beyond that, they're not really associated with a deity or entity of any sort. They're just undead. But here's where it gets the most interesting, because everything I've just told you isn't the whole truth. The seven didn't do this by themselves. There was an eighth that they have done their best to not mention in any capacity since, and the eighth is actually the god Chaos, which is probably not its actual name. All of the other gods have different, styled names, like the elf is Tyr Sindelius, the lizard god is Zoralstissa, and then for Chaos they just gave him the weird name. So immediately as the other gods were making their races, what happened first was that Chaos made demons the race he is responsible for. The other gods immediately went absolutely not, more than likely fearful of his power, and collectively they all got up and seemingly couldn't kill Chaos for whatever reason, but successfully banished him to another plane of existence called Tartarus. Tartarus is the closest thing Rivellon has to what Hell is, which is probably relevant given the Hellstone of this upcoming game. They didn't stop there, however, and basically Chaos has been trying to escape and subvert his bonds ever since, and that's going to be real important later. Because while Chaos seems well and truly locked into Tartarus, his demons are a different story. There are ways and means through which they can reach other planes, and he uses them to, of course, try to further his own ends, and the gods, at least at the height of their power, were pretty good at keeping this from happening. So that's kind of the basic structure that you need to know going into this. That's like the foundation of how the universe was set up and how it works. However, I mentioned those weren't the other gods, and truth be told, they might retcon every single one of these. These guys aren't really mentioned in Divinity Original Sin 1 or 2 in much of any capacity, and so you have to take all of them with a grain of salt. Outside of probably Astarte. So Astarte is the goddess of source, the powerful life energy that everybody's using as a whole. She is the goddess of it. She plays a central role in Original Sin 1 and is probably the only one of these gods that can be taken as canon. All of the others, it's touch and go. But there are several other mentioned. As I've already mentioned, Ouroboros, the god of the dragons. We actually see dragon knights, and dragon knights are the chosen servants of actual dragons. They are granted a bunch of power, one of which is to turn into a dragon, but it's not a true dragon, mind you. And we see dragon knights like slain in Original Sin 2, and if everything holds, they got their power from actual dragons, because that's how that's supposed to work. Dragons are even mentioned directly, as I mentioned earlier, in the Red Prince's origin story, so like dragons are around, but whether or not their god Ouroboros is still canon that we learned about from Patriarch the Black, who knows? Another really interesting one that only comes up in Beyond Divinity and was then never mentioned again. Beyond Divinity takes place in Nemesis. You learn about the plane of Nemesis, which is an important place actually, mostly in this game and a book that preceded it, but the demons, trying to escape Tartarus, invaded Nemesis and just successfully took it over. It's what they would like to do to Rivellon, and so Nemesis is also associated with the demons because they control it. However, it wasn't theirs to begin with. There was another race that occupied it called the Renari. These guys have not been mentioned since, but Nemesis has. So Nemesis exists, we just don't know if the Renari are actually like canonically residents there. The Renari had a god named Ran, which is R-A-A-N, but yes, also just sounds like the name Ran. And then last but not least, there was a random lizard god mentioned in one of the books after Divine Divinity called Trogda. Is only mentioned briefly in that book and then never comes up again. Probably not canon, but worth a mention, I suppose. So, long story short, the 7 are the most important gods, but there's a lot more than them. Now from here, now that we've sort of established that baseline, what we're going to do next is go over the games and the most relevant parts of the lore from here. Now, in the future, I'll be making a timeline video that discusses these in greater depth, but here we're just going to hit the important parts, basically. So, first up, chronologically, from the timeline, mind you, is Dragon Commander. As mentioned, it's basically irrelevant. It comes up in 8800 AR. It is like 10,000 years before the important events in terms of the actual video games. Story-wise, you take on the role of a dragon knight who has to get an empire under control by fighting a bunch of wars, real-time strategy style. Maxos and Corvus are probably the only important parts of it. None of this stuff is ever touched again in the series. Which brings us to Original Sin 1 in 4 AD. As I mentioned, this game is a little more allegorical in its approach to storytelling. It tells the tale of 2 source hunters, people who are dedicated to tracking down people who have been misusing Source and its powers in order to kill them. These people are later called sorcerers because they are misusing the power they've been given. That's actually an important point that comes up later a lot more in Original Sin 2. Basically, something that was actually established in the very first game they ever made, Divine Divinity, but then wasn't made use of until later, is that Source has become corrupted. It's a huge part of the games. But even in the very first game, in the very first village you start with, they mention that Source used to be this power that they could tap into for great healing, but it's become corrupted in recent years. Now, Divine Divinity takes place in 1218. Original Sin 1 takes place in 4 AD, so like 1200 years prior, that corruption was already beginning to spread and people would misuse Source, but it wasn't as big of a problem back then. Generally, they would just dispatch Source hunters to deal with the issues. This was established because in the preceding years, we saw things like the Source King, or Brachus Rex as he's known. He comes up a few times, he's everybody's favorite villain. People like Brachus Rex were the first people to realize that they could take advantage of Source for nefarious ends outside of what we see with the gods that is established later in Original Sin 2, technically. So long story short, already we see problems with people misusing Source. Source hunters get dispatched to deal with it. Well, along the way, we get involved in a bigger narrative involving the goddess of Source, Astarte, and the end of time. This is where it gets a little more allegorical. Astarte effectively opened Pandora's box by sneaking into a garden that was guarded by two divine warriors set there to protect it, but she sneaks in, distracts them, opens this box, and unleashes what is called the Void Dragon. The goal of Original Sin 1 is to put this thing down because at the end of time, in the far future, the Void Dragon is meant to end all of the world, and your job is to, not let that happen, and there's like some time jumping around, that kind of thing. It gets a little all over the place. And the weird thing is, the Void Dragon just doesn't come up again. Neither does Astarte, really. She gets a brief mention in Original Sin 2, there's some references to her, but she doesn't come up again in a meaningful way in Original Sin 2. And so the Void Dragon, which is obviously connected to the void that the Eternals were thrown into, there kind of sadly just isn't really more information on. Again, plot holes, that kind of thing. Not too much more to say about this one. It's also hard to say how much of this you should take literally, but probably worth a mention that there is recurring characters from this game into Original Sin 2. Again, 1200 and some change years later, like Jahan. Jahan is a character that made a deal with a demon, actually, to receive an extraordinarily long life, and thanks to the events of Original Sin 1, you help him kill the demon that gave him his power, which lets him retain his immortality, which is why he lives long enough to meet you in Original Sin 2. He's also my favorite character in the entire series, but that's neither here nor there. So there are some direct connections between Original Sin 1 and the other games, but most of it almost reads and plays more like a myth rather than detailed events, so it's hard to say exactly how many of these we should take as canon. Next up, however, we take a step back in terms of releases, but forward in terms of chronological order, and that is Divine Divinity, the very first game. This takes place in 1218 AD, and as mentioned, it tells the story of Lucian the Divine before they became the Divine. Canonically, this is the journey you go on to become the Divine, so some of the lore concepts here aren't entirely fleshed out. It's also not the Original Sin 1 and 2 games, so it's hard to say how much of this really matters outside of the stuff that is then later confirmed in those games. But nonetheless, there is some stuff that we know happened because it is mentioned in the Original Sin games, and they wouldn't make any sense unless these things happened, so there is that. Basically, outside of becoming the Divine, the story of Divine Divinity is about the Sword of Lies, and by the way, speaking of the Sword of Lies, you may notice that a lot of the Divinity games have weird names, and you can thank Larian's publisher at the time for that because Divine Divinity was initially supposed to be named Divinity Sword of Lies, which would have made more sense, but basically, in the last 1200 years since Original Sin 1 and Divine Divinity, demons have been trying to get in. Wars with demons have been fought. They have been pushed back. One such battle involved a sword called the Sword of Lies. This is a weapon that was wielded by one of the demons of the invasion, the Demon of Lies if you'd believe it, but there's a catch to the sword. The sword was imbued with a fragment of the power from the god Chaos himself. So what Lucian actually winds up thwarting here is the plans for Chaos to manifest himself outside of Tartarus, thus escaping his bonds so he can fight the gods again. His plan was to put himself into this sword that one of his demons would then carry into Rivellon, the actual plane of existence, and then they would imbue that piece of him into another being in Rivellon. In this case, a baby at the time known as Damien, or who would later be named Damien. Much of the early games was focused all around this kid. So, long story short, what happens is that Lucian successfully ascends to the position of the Divine so he can fight the Demon of Lies, but the catch is you're actually a little too late. While you do stop the invasion and kill the demon and everything, what you did not stop was the transfer of the piece of Chaos into this baby, Damien, meaning that this baby just has a piece of the Chaos God in him. And the thing is, Lucian canonically could not bring himself to do anything about this. He couldn't kill an infant. So what he plans to do instead later turns out to be a catastrophic mistake, which is to raise Damien and try to set him on a better path. That is where the game Divine Divinity ends, and then we don't pick up again until 1238 AD, about 20 years later, when Damien has actually been banished to the plane called Nemesis because things did not go well. The events in between these two games are largely detailed in the form of a novel, but the long and short of it is basically this. Things went relatively normal until Damien became a teenager. You know how teenagers are. He even joined Lucian's Divine Order. Lucian, after becoming the Divine, established the Divine Order, basically all of the military orders that worked for him, the Magisters, the Paladins, they come up in later games. All the people who serve him as his army and keep the peace, that kind of thing. Well, Damien joined up with the Divine Order to become a warrior. He's been taught spells, he's got a natural affinity for magic, that kind of thing, but things get complicated when he meets a girl named Yagurna. Initially, this is fine, but cut to the chase, it turns out that Yagurna is actually a member of the Black Ring. The Black Ring is a sect of people who has served demons and the Chaos God since long before Damien came around, but they did help facilitate him becoming what he is, though. The Black Ring serves Damien, always, even now when he didn't know who he was, and so Yagurna, being a member of the Black Ring, basically shows Damien who he really is and what he's capable of, and after Lucian steps in to try to solve this with violence, as is his usual note, it doesn't go well and it leads to a war between Lucian and his son Damien, the Damned One, versus Lucian, the Divine One. This actually ends because Damien, being inexperienced with his power, gets tricked by Lucian into a place called a Rift Temple. Lucian uses this temple to banish Damien to the realm of Nemesis, which also turns out to be a mistake of sorts. However, he doesn't just throw him in there, he seals it with a divine seal. The only way that Damien can leave Nemesis is with Lucian or his successor, the Divine basically, or someone of the Divine Order, bringing them, that is to say Damien, out of Nemesis with them, which then brings us to Beyond Divinity in 1238 AD, as I mentioned. So, to put it very simply, Beyond Divinity is about how Damien escaped from Nemesis. You start the game as a paladin of the Divine Order that goes to put down a member of the Black Ring. You inadvertently get stuck in Nemesis after this went sideways, and you wake up sort of soulbound, as they call it, to Damien, who at the time was just like a generic Death Knight. To you, the paladin, anyway. And Beyond Divinity has you, the paladin, and who turns out to be Damien, fighting your way through Nemesis, basically tricking you, because if you remember what I said, Damien could only leave if he does so with the company of a member of the Divine Order, or like Lucian himself. So the entirety of Beyond Divinity is the journey that you as a paladin go on to help Damien escape inadvertently from Nemesis because he tricks you. That's the whole point of that game. But it gets a little more complicated. In reward for your inadvertent service, Damien just lets the paladin involved go. Nobody knows what happened to that paladin. He disappeared after this. Which I mentioned because if they wanted to get crafty, they could bring that guy back in some capacity. I think that would be cool. But also, the thing is, Damien also disappears after this. You see, you may think he might immediately get up to no good or something, but after escaping from Nemesis, the dude just vanishes. And Lucian has been so embroiled in everything else going on in the events of Original Sin 2 that he either didn't notice or didn't care. And by the way, pretty much all of this is directly mentioned in Original Sin 2. There are references to the God King, the Chaos God, Damien himself, so all of this should be canon for all intents and purposes. So Damien escapes, he just disappears, we don't hear from him again until Divinity 2, which, as I've already mentioned several times, is questionable in terms of its canonicity, let's say. If they're going to cut anything, it's probably going to be that game, to be honest, but we'll see what happens. More on that in a moment, because a few years after Damien escapes is when the events of Divinity Original Sin 2 happen. But as usual, in between those games, we've had some hiccups along the way. The fight with the Black Ring has never really stopped. It has continued, and in fact, as usual, Lucian doing bad things with his divine power just leads to more problems that he creates. The thing is, his ultimate plan at this point, which you learn at the end of Original Sin 2, is to purge all source from the world, because in Original Sin 2, it has become clear that the corruption of the source has become pretty much absolute. Almost everybody who touches it or is involved with it in almost any way becomes just an awful, awful person known as a sorcerer. While yes, some of them are harmless, most of them have fallen to the corruption of the source and become monstrous people, doing just absolutely heinous stuff that make the stuff that happened in the new game's trailer look banal. However, thanks to the sort of comedic tone of some of the previous games, wasn't necessarily at the forefront of it, and thus the tone of this new game is darker. Either way, seeing all the problems Source has caused, the fact that we have some new problems that are about to be introduced, Lucian wants to seal the veil, the power that was taken from it in order to make the gods and everything, to basically solve two problems. Solve the corruption of the source, but also to patch the veil to stop the Voidwoken from getting in. But what happened to the veil? Well, it was weakened a bit when the gods took their power from it. But as long as the gods were around to keep it stable, it was fine. Lucian, however, in his war with the Black Ring, made a very large mistake. He killed most of the elves. The thing is, the elves were important because all of the races of the gods are important. The seven feed themselves off the source that the races they created gather up. This means that when Lucian killed all of the elves in his war against the Black Ring by using Death Fog, this sort of like instant death poisonous gas in order to kill an invading Black Ring army, he also kills all these elves. He kills so many of them that it weakens their god, Tyr Sindelius. And this is the first crack in a dam, basically. Tyr Sindelius, no longer at full power, is unable to keep his part of the Veil stable, which starts to let in the Voidwoken. What are the Voidwoken? Well, you remember those Eternals that were cast out into the void? They did not just disappear, and they are very angry. So they start coming in. In fact, they start showing up wherever sorcerers are. Whoever is using Source inadvertently draws the Voidwoken to them because of their connection with the Veil and everything. The Voidwoken are ultimately led by the God King still. He desperately wants his world back as far as he's concerned, and he's going to kill these thieving upstarts if it's the last thing he does and everything they created. Ironically, pretty justified in his anger, but it's, rough either way. So while there is honestly a lot more to Original Sin 2 than that, that's basically the gist of it. You play one of the origin characters or a generic character that you create known as the Godwoken. Altogether they are Godwoken, people with the potential to become the next divine. However, you find out that Lucian actually faked his death in order to gather up all of the source, using, again, heinous means because he eventually realizes what happened with the elves and concocts this plan to try to shore up the Veil while also taking source from everybody else. Now, ultimately, depending on the status of Divinity 2 and whether or not it's canon, we can talk a little more about the endings of Original Sin 2, because what happens next is the result of player choices. It's possible for Lucian to succeed, which, unfortunately for everybody, Lucian's awful, and it turns out he might have been right. Like, the best ending, arguably, is the one where you have Source be purged from the world, letting go of your own power, which is a bad look because it actually typically results in people being turned into what are called silent monks, which are like people with lobotomies practically. So it's a bad ending for your character, but a good ending for the rest of the world when you go that route. But there are also others where you ascend to the throne of divinity itself. There are really bad endings where you share divine power with a demon who inadvertently isn't going to just let that go. But the catch is, as fun as all of those endings are, really only like one of them makes sense for the next game in the series, Divinity 2, Ego Draconis, the third-person action adventure. And that is the source being purged. You see, because the story of Divinity 2 is a bit different. Damien makes his return suddenly and without mercy. He starts brutally butchering his way across the countryside. But the catch is, we play an inadvertent Dragon Knight. So another sort of branch of the Divine Order are the Dragon Slayers, people who hunt down and kill dragons and Dragon Knights. Turns out it's probably not a good idea, but you become the last Dragon Knight, basically, as part of that game. And the catch is, Lucian has been gone. He just kind of disappeared. But why is that? Well, basically everyone thinks a Dragon Knight killed him, which is why the Dragon Slayers are brutally murdering all of your kind. But the thing is, Lucian is not dead. He was kidnapped. He was kidnapped by Damien and put into an alternate plane called Hyperneurotomachia, basically a place outside of time. Lucian is trapped there. Damien, having set this up to look like he was murdered by a Dragon Knight, also then leads the Dragon Slayers to kill the main force that could have resisted him, and thus Damien starts sweeping the land. Your job as a Dragon Knight is to not let that happen, and over the course of the main game and its expansion, Flames of Vengeance, you manage to successfully stop the initial invasion, but not Damien himself. Damien resurrects his girlfriend, Yagurna. You kill her, but Damien himself escapes. He does not die here. He is still the avatar of chaos. And by the way, just in case you're wondering, Divinity 2 has like airships and stuff, which is really fun. And the reasoning behind that is that supposedly, and this is like the only time Dragon Commander really comes up in the lore, Damien, all the years he was gone and disappeared, rediscovered some of the technology from Dragon Commander all those years back and was able to like reverse engineer that into like airships and the stuff that we saw in that game, just like a fun little connection. But Divinity 2 ends with Lucian being freed from his captivity and Damien free, but Yagurna dead and his overall invasion stopped. Now the catch here is The only sort of place that makes sense is if all of the source got purged in Original Sin 2, because that would actually weaken Lucian. He would be a false divine at that point. And Damien being able to so easily capture him and fake his death and just take him out of the picture makes a lot more sense in that regard, because then you're left with the Dragon Knights, whose main source of power was the ancient dragons who rivaled the gods in power anyway. And so their Dragon Knights are extremely powerful, probably more powerful than the divine himself at this point. And while yes, Lucian is still an old veteran warrior who could probably hold his own, he is no longer the divine, most likely, in Divinity 2. But that's just speculation, because we don't actually know what the canon ending of that is or the canonical status of the Dragon Knight saga. Which brings us to the fun part, good old-fashioned speculation. So, Divinity 2, that I was just talking about, took place in 1300 AD, about 60 years or so after the events of Divinity Original Sin 2. Fast forward to today, where we then have the announcement of this new game, and the press release that says Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2 are the most relevant to this game that is being released, and suddenly we've got some things to talk about, but it absolutely must be said, all of this is speculation. I do not have an answer here. The only people that know this right now are Larian. So from here, I'm going to talk about everything else that this could be, or at least the stuff that makes the most sense to me, I suppose. So from the trailer and everything, we also hear that the gods have gone silent, which makes sense. They all died in Divinity Original Sin 2. That is to say, the 7 gods died in Divinity Original Sin 2. You kill them as part of that game, in fact, in an incredibly weakened state, mind you, so they're not at full power, but they die. Lucian, as part of his elaborate plot, was soaking up all of their source, which was weakening them and killing them over time, so he could purge all of the source like we were just talking about. So, judging by the fact that the gods are supposed to be silent, it's supposed to be informed by 1 or 2, I think it makes the most sense for this game likely to be taking place after Original Sin 2, but whether or not it's before or after the Divinity 2 Ego Draconis game, I couldn't tell you, I have no idea. Fallen Heroes, the cancelled game, was supposed to mess around with the time between those two games as well, so I'm wondering if they kept that part of this and just moved forward with it, but who knows. Long story short though, chances are the gods are just straight up dead, because that's what happens in Original Sin 2. And in this trailer, it looks like we see people sacrificing things to the gods to hopefully bring them back. I think that's one of the ways you could interpret the festival and everything going on in that trailer. Especially when you realize like the 7-pointed star on that guy's chest is one of Lucian's symbols, but it looks like it's upside down even. The thing is, as you picked up on if you were paying attention throughout this whole quite long video, the gods were holding back some pretty nasty stuff, from the Voidwoken and the demons to Damien and his black ring and everything else. There was just a lot of stuff going on that they were actively stopping. These gods are dead now. They can't stop that stuff anymore because they're not here, which is a byproduct, yet again, of Lucian's plan here. And so, I think what is very possibly going on here is that in the wake of the death of the gods, we see these other forces trying to stake their claim again. So in the wake of Original Sin 2, when you don't purge all the source, like you wage war against the Black Ring and the Voidwoken just continually as it goes on, and it kind of churns on forever. That's the epilogue. It's a kind of bleak ending in the sense that it's never-ending war, but you are all-powerful. And from that ending, even, you can take that these forces don't just give up just because you were successful and took the role of divine in Original Sin 2 if you went that route. The only thing that actually stops them is the source being purged, which would make sense for the Voidwoken and stuff for a while, but then we have to ask ourselves, if that happened, what happened to Chaos? Like, even if the source is all purged and the Veil is restored, the gods are still dead, and they were presumably what was keeping him in Tartarus. So if they're all dead, is Chaos able to get out? Is this Hellstone and what happens at the end of the trailer a portal for his forces into Rivellon? Is that how they established it? Maybe. If that's the case, what is going on then with the Voidwoken and the God King? The God King should survive. There is an ending with Fane, one of the origin characters in Original Sin 2, where you can shut out the God King himself, but restore the rest of the Eternals, which is kind of an ending unique to him. It's possible they would go with that, but it's not really the vibe I'm getting from the trailer or anything. So when it comes to what this game could be about, for me right now, based on everything we know, it comes down to a few different things. What is the canon status of Divinity 2 Ego Draconis? Does that matter at all? Are they letting that go? Are they playing around with the space between Original Sin 2 and Ego Draconis? Does this take place after that and they've just kind of moved the timeline ahead even farther? What's going on, basically? In fact, I think one possible thing, I've seen some speculation on this, I don't necessarily think I agree with this stance personally, but I saw some people mentioning that maybe the guy being burned was Lucian himself, and if this takes place after the Dragon Knight saga, when Lucian was a false divine, that's not entirely impossible in that specific scenario where they sacrificed him and then inadvertently unleashed the gates to hell here. Again, I don't put much stock in that one personally, but I can't deny the possibility of it. But long story short, depending on a bunch of different factors on the route they decide to go with in terms of the ending for Original Sin 2 and the canon status of Divinity 2, to me, it kind of looks like some of these forces that the gods were holding back are making their return. Looks to me to be demonic in nature, so my bet would be Chaos, the demons, and Damien himself, but also can't deny the possibility of the Voidwoken and the God King, as they were never explicitly dealt with in Original Sin 2 either, but again, just from the trailer and stuff, it looks more demonic than Voidwoken to me, so I'm inclined to go that route. But here's the catch. That's just what they could do with the established stuff. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, the canon status of all these games is questionable at best, and they like to be flexible and move things around as needed. So I think there is a very, very real possibility that they either institute new stuff, come up with new threats, new problems, new lore arising from whatever they are working on, or they might just retcon some stuff and take it in an entirely new direction. I can't discount that possibility either. But to me, kind of laying it all out, those are kind of where I'm at with all of this. That kind of looks to be the general scope of it. Now, there's some other minor stuff that this video doesn't cover, to be honest, like the fact that orcs are in the trailer that I mentioned in my initial video. They were more of an enemy and an antagonist and an enemy to be fought in all of the other games. They come up as people you have to fight a lot, actually. Here, they seem to be integrated with the rest of people, as opposed to an active antagonist. So that's already a gameplay decision that they've made. But pulling all that together, I think that is just about everything that is super important to know right now. There is some other stuff that I've dug into. I've got a whole lore playlist you can go through and get to various individual topics and how they're presented throughout the games and stuff. Do keep in mind they're a little bit old, but the information itself should still be up to date besides that timeline video, which I'll have to update, but even that should be mostly correct. There's just some parts around the Divinity 2 Dragon Knight saga I'd like to clear up. So hopefully, with any luck, this video brought you up to speed on all the important Divinity lore ahead of this game, and it's honestly probably still a long ways off, so we've certainly got some time, but I was excited and wanted to share this. As I love this universe, if you couldn't tell, I plan to cover this game every step of the way, and so if you want to see more of that, or you're excited for more lore videos even, by all means, comment, subscribe, stick around, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.